Scottish Affairs Committee in our ongoing inquiry in 25 years of devolution, and we're delighted to be joined by a couple of colleagues who are also a couple of former Secretaries of State who will now introduce themselves and anything by way of a short introductory statement. And we'll start with you, Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to attend here. And we have watched the proceedings thus far with interest. I think this is an interesting and a very timely investigation for the committee to be having. Having been part of the movement to see the creation of a Scottish Parliament in 1997 with the colleagues in the Labour Party, the churches, local authorities through the Constitutional Convention, having then been part of the discussions around the setting up of the Calman Commission, which led to the 2012 Scotland Act, and then the Smith Commission, which led to the 2016 Scotland Act. I think it demonstrates what I believe, although Des Brown always disputes this, that Donald Dewar described devolution as a process rather than as an event. And of course, it's inevitably going to always be like that, because devolution within the United Kingdom will be asymmetric, inevitably, because of the relative sizes of the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. Personally, although I've always been a supporter of devolution, I am by instinct a federalist, and I think, as I look around my family in all parts of the United Kingdom, that there are still my family in England are as badly served by a highly centralised model of government from Whitehall as anybody in Scotland ever was. So I think hopefully that is a process that will continue and will bring to the other parts of the United Kingdom the benefits that we have had. It's also interesting to observe how it has developed in Scotland, in Wales, and of course in Northern Ireland then, which has had different routes for its devolved assembly. But as the changes come, I think the existence and the operation of the process becomes more important. Sometimes you can get by just on personalities working well together, but if that doesn't happen, then you find that the process becomes more important. And there's always a balance to be struck there. There is a risk that you end up in process for the sake of process, so it's got to be driven by the outcome. And of course, in recent years, we've had Brexit, and that does bring some areas where there needs to be perhaps a fresh look at things. I think about the question of agricultural support payments, for example. We came out with the European Common Agricultural Policy, and now effectively really what we need is a United Kingdom Common Agricultural Policy, because you have policy going in different directions and at different rates in different parts of the United Kingdom. And personally, I think it is not satisfactory that DEFRA, for example, should hold the ring for the United Kingdom as a whole while still prosecuting England's case. So we need to find some mechanism for dealing with that sort of issue. And of course, there's still the question of finance. So Scotland, in terms of agricultural support payments, gets something in the region of 17% of what the United Kingdom as a whole has. But that begs two questions. 17% of what? And secondly, what do you do when the world changes? You've seen already the impact of Ukraine pushing food security up the political agenda. So that 17% might work now because it's worked for quite some time, but it won't necessarily remain like that going ahead. So what I believe Donald Dewar referred to as a process rather than an event continues to change and to evolve, and as part of Scotland's voice at Westminster, I am fascinated to see how that goes, and I shall look forward with interest to seeing your own conclusions on it.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. And Mr. Mundell.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wishart, and it's a pleasure to appear again before this committee. I think the inquiry is timely. In May, it will be 25 years since the first elections to the Scottish Parliament. I was very honoured to be elected to that first Parliament as a regional member for the south of Scotland. I think from what I've seen of the evidence that the committee has taken, that its initial analysis that that period, the period from 1999 through to 2007, didn't really see a full exploration of intergovernmental relations, because essentially matters were dealt with through internal Labour Party channels, and Gordon Brown at that point was obviously a very significant part of the government. We then had a period where we had a change of government at Westminster compared to the arrangements at Holyrood, and that, I think, flushed out the need for these mechanisms actually to come into play during that period, and there was a greater development and evolution of the process. But then in 2014 we had a very significant event of the independence referendum in Scotland, and in 2016 we had the significant event of Brexit and the Brexit referendum. And I think those are two of the most impactful political events that have happened in our lifetimes, and therefore it is inevitable that those events put any mechanism or process that's in place to the ultimate test.
Excellent, and thank you both ever so much for your concern. The comments almost feel like we don't need to ask any more questions now, but we'll give it a bash. Just first of all, you both shared the Scotland office for a couple of years, obviously. And David, you were under parliamentary state. Did you get on well together when you were sharing an office, given different parties?
I think before and since. I mean, we have our differences, but I flatter myself that over the years I've tried as far as possible to work on a personal level with colleagues in Parliament as well as you can do, because unnecessary disagreements don't really help anyone.
You both covered a particularly fascinating...
Of course, we were greatly helped by having Christine as part of the operation to smooth the waters and keep the coalition on course.
You were in post a very interesting and fascinating period of the devolution journey, and like you mentioned, of course, the independence referendum, and it was a reset of intergovernmental relations. What did you make of what you observed, both of you as Secretaries of State, of the condition of intergovernmental relations at the point when you were Secretary of State? Did you feel that they were working adequately, or were you frustrated that you weren't able to get that type of engagement and they weren't doing the job that you felt they should? We'll start with you, David, if that's all right.
Well, I think obviously I became Secretary of State after the independence referendum, after the 2015 UK general election. I think in reflecting on the period back, and I think it's been said by others in evidence, probably the Edinburgh Agreement, the agreement that led to the referendum, was possibly a high point in terms of those relations, because an extremely potentially contentious issue was taken and agreement was reached. And I think there have been many disputes around the referendum, but I think there have been few around the conduct of the referendum, the process that led to the referendum. And I found that in the immediate period after I became Secretary of State, that there was a genuinely positive overall working relationship with the Scottish Government, and that we were able, through the mechanisms that were in place, to pursue a constructive relationship. I always tried to separate what I would call the practicalities from the politics. It's inevitable that there is politics, particularly when you have different parties, when you obviously have a very different approach in relation to the constitutional. There will always be politics. Everybody on this committee and myself and Alistair are familiar with how politics works. I remember in the days when Alex Salmond was First Minister, surprisingly, the Scottish Government always wrote to the UK Government late on a Saturday afternoon. And surprisingly, that then appeared in the next day's Sunday papers.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was before the current difficulties with Royal Mail.
Indeed. So we knew how it operated, the politics operated. I tried myself to separate the politics and the politics which were engaged between the governments, the parties in this House, from the practicalities. And that worked pretty well up until the Brexit period. And then the Brexit period, was an event of such political moment that it was much, much more difficult to do that in that, in that context.
And that's a very good point that we're hearing repeatedly in this inquiry, and I think most of our witnesses have been keen to describe and explain to us that there's the three different and distinct periods of devolution. First, the one party in power arrangements that we had very early on. Then there was a second period where there was divergence in Scotland and Edinburgh, which Alex Salmond curiously describes as a golden period of intergovernment relations. And then the period that you described, Mr. Mundell. And I'll come to you, Mr. Carmichael, because that was what Alex Salmond did tell us at that period, even though there was an independence referendum going on. Is that how you felt when you were Secretary of State? Did you see this as a good period for intergovernment relations, or has this been exaggerated to some degree, do you think?
Well, I think that was not one distinct period. I mean, the events that led up to the completion of the Edinburgh Agreement in 2012 was a productive period, and it was productive because there was a political will to make it productive. I would hope that the golden age of intergovernmental relations is yet to come. But then once you were into that campaign, and you remember, we all remember what the campaign actually was like, there was a sense, I think, that the politics did sometimes get in the way of good government. And there were some things that, frankly, became issues because it suited people to make them issues. I was thinking about it just over the weekend there. I don't remember the exact circumstances because it was quite involved, but at the time of the introduction of contracts for difference in the energy market, there was a concern about the switching off of ROCs, the Renewable Obligations Certificate that preceded the contracts for difference. And that was something where actually the administration had been devolved, although it was legislatively competent to the United Kingdom government in Westminster. And I remember the frustration that many in government here had, that the then Energy Minister in Scotland would say, yes, of course, we're going to do this so it can all be done in lockstep, but somehow or another it never quite happened. And I can't remember actually whether or not the administrative devolution was withdrawn or whether it was eventually resolved. But something like that really should be an administrative detail that would be dealt with by officials, suddenly becomes embroiled in the political level with ministers and SPADs and goodness knows who else. But look, we are charged as members of Parliament and as ministers to run government, but at the same time we are politicians. These tensions are always going to arise, and I think as a whole, the whole process of that referendum was quite an achievement for everyone, and I think that history will judge it as a positive exercise.
Is that your experience, Mr. Mundell, generally good relationships during that? Is it
yes, I mean, obviously there were individual issues that came up and the Scottish Government would want to put themselves in a favourable light and the UK Government in an unfavourable light. Part of the job that Alistair and I did was to ensure that the facts were available and that we weren't acting in an unfavourable light. But it wasn't as intense then as I think it became, in a sense of Scottish Government good, Westminster Government bad, which did, I think, develop in subsequent years. What we were trying to do was we were trying to, as I say, work in the most constructive way that we could. I think that we did want to develop good personal relationships. I was in a fortunate position, having been a member of the Scottish Parliament, that I had worked in Holyrood with Nicola Sturgeon, with John Swinney, Alec Neil, Rosanna Cunningham, the people who were the principal ministers in the Scottish Government. So it was always possible in those periods.
Can you just focus on that, because this is something that's come out again quite powerfully in a lot of the evidence that we've acquired. It was all about the personalities. If the people were able to get on, there was more of a productive outcome in terms of working together. And sometimes when the personalities didn't get on, it challenged the structures just a little bit more, and the structures became more important to be able to accommodate those differences of opinion. Do you think we've got it about right in terms of the structures that's in place to accommodate if people don't get on, differences in personalities, when you look at what we've got just now?
Well, I think obviously the process has evolved. I think if there are, fundamental differences between individuals and personality clashes, that's not going to be straightforward to accommodate, because a large part of politics is about relationships. It is about doing deals, if you want to put it that way, reaching accommodations, about having trust and respect. So the relationships are, the relationships are important. I felt I had a particularly good relationship with Mr. Swinney, for example, that if we did get into a dead end, that we could have a frank discussion about whether it was possible to get out of it. Sometimes it wasn't possible to get out of it because the politics of the situation were were insurmountable. But we could have, a frank discussion about the situation, and I found that very positive. I don't know if he referenced it in his evidence, but Alex Salmond had a very good relationship with George Osborne, and during that period of government, that was an important way of being able to discuss issues and concerns.
How do you value that?
I think that political will is a big part of this. I think back to my time in the Scotland office, I inherited a joint working party which Angela Constance and I co-chaired, which was productive and it did work well. And I thought it never achieved everything that either side would have wanted it to, but with a bit of professionalism and political goodwill, you could achieve that. It doesn't always work like that, but the picture is always going to be mixed.
Just lastly from me, just because we're interested about the infrastructure, how it all comes together. The JMCs actually meet during your time as Secretary, so did in your time, yes? Yeah,
I mean, they tended to be pretty much set-piece occasions. I don't think I ever sort of looked at the entry and thought, my goodness, we need a GMC to sort this lot out. They tended to be kind of showpieces, and everybody came with their press releases already written. But that does often show the importance of getting this balance right in structures, and even the base structures in the world will not work if the personalities are determined not to make them work.
And we were all around during the Calman Commission and the Scotland Act as it was of 2012. I remember Mr Mundell teasing me about Antarctica during the conversations around that. But one of the major innovations from the Calman Commission was the dispute resolution mechanism. Did either of you ever invoke that or use it at all as part of your time as Secretary of
I would struggle to remember an occasion where we actually invoked it, but that's not to say it didn't happen.
The occasion I recall is around the Olympics, and there was the 2012 Olympics, and there was issues as to whether some of the ancillary activity to the Olympics should carry with it a Barnett consequential. I see Christine nodding in recollection of that. But for example,
Wincing, I think.
So, for example, the view of the Scottish Government and I think the Welsh Assembly Government was that housing that had been provided initially as accommodation for the Olympics was actually housing, and therefore there should be yes.
Thank you. And we move over to Christine Jardine. Christine.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could just touch on something that you both have mentioned about the personal relationships and how they developed. And David Cameron, while he was Prime Minister, did, we understand, take the time to build personal relationships with the First Minister, one-to-one meetings without officials present. If I can ask you both individually, did you observe that and what the effect of that was on the relationship? How important was that pre-2012 to building up what Alex Salmond has, with no hyperbole at all, referred to as a golden age?
You would have seen that more closely. I was toiling in the Whip's office at that time.
Yes, well, it doesn't surprise me that Alex Salmond would feel that he'd been part of a golden age. I think, as I said, there were strong relationships. George Osborne had a very strong relationship with Mr. Salmond, David Cameron was very respectful of Mr. Salmond and respectful of the fact that Mr. Salmond had achieved a majority in the 2011 election, and therefore that was the basis on which to take forward referendum discussion. So I think I think across the piece, and I think it was David Cameron's style in relation to a range of matters that he was involved in government. Was to engage with those whom he was dealing with. I mean, some people were easier to engage with others, but I think what he did, he came into office on the basis of what we had said in the 2010 manifesto about wishing to pursue a respect agenda with the devolved administrations, and I believe he did deliver on that.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think that approach continued under Theresa May, particularly in a relationship with Nicola Sturgeon? Do you think that changed? And if so, why?
Well, I can only give my own observation. I think my first impression was that Nicola Sturgeon and Theresa May had a mutual respect because there were two. Theresa was the second woman Prime Minister, and Nicola was the first woman First Minister of Scotland. So I think there was a mutual respect. But I think there is no doubt that over the period of time that Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister of Scotland, she became much more difficult to deal with. When I was a minister, I feel I worked quite effectively with her, even on very contentious issues. For example, there was an issue to make changes to discretionary housing payments in Scotland to accommodate the so-called bedroom tax, and I worked closely with Nicola on that, and that was possible. But in the post-Brexit period, my impression was that Nicola Sturgeon became much more strident and difficult to deal with. Now, she might well argue that that was her standing up for Scotland or her agenda, but it became much more difficult, the dealings, and we went down a route which we may come back to later in relation to other matters, of a much greater, what I would describe as Scottish exceptionalism. So in the initial period that I was involved, both as a Minister and Secretary of State, the general view was that working together was the best way to achieve outcomes. In the latter part, certainly of my tenure, the view coming from Edinburgh was we are going to just do everything ourselves because we can.
That's very interesting, because you've already mentioned Brexit as a potential watershed and the change of relationship. And I picked up from what you were both saying about 2012 and the run-up to the Edinburgh Agreement, and certainly from other evidence we've had, that was a very smooth period, good relationship, as Mr Carmichael has said, a political will to get things done. But then in the period 2012 to 2014, that changed. And we now see very much more of what I think one of you referred to as Scottish government good, UK government bad, and vice versa, all the time. Do you think that there has been, or to what extent do you think there has been since 2012, a shift in the relationship and the respect between the two administrations that has potentially damaged both?
I think the political drive that came with the 2014 referendum inevitably had an impact on the relations. I think it will be a long time before we get back to anything like the quality of working relationships that we've had in the past. And for as long as the Constitution remains front and centre of the political debate for anyone of any party, then that becomes a divisive issue. Everybody back down into their silos. And it does make moving on in a more collaborative way that much more difficult, because it reopens the wounds, if you like. But I'm a great believer. I mean, essentially, I'm a Liberal Democrat, so I'm an optimist. And I think that time is a great healer. And I have a sense, actually, that now you see a broader range of views emerging from a number of different parties, and within that Yes movement, that there may be scope for us to go away from constitutional identity politics and back more to ideological politics.
I think there was, on reflection now, certainly in Whitehall, a naive expectation that it would be possible to move on after the referendum. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that was dispelled the day after, when two things essentially happened. Those people who had been calling for independence continued to call for independence despite the fact that we had just had a referendum. And secondly, it was the beginning of this period of sort of conspiracy theory and open mistrust, because I think, as you may recall, as part of the so-called vow, the government had agreed to table a motion in Parliament, but because Parliament wasn't sitting, it wasn't possible to table the motion. But this was immediately identified as bad faith, and that somehow the government had already gone back on its commitments in relation to the referendum and what would happen subsequently. But I do think that probably the Whitehall machine was naive in thinking that the referendum would be definitive we would move on and not discuss these issues subsequently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Shanks.
Thank you, and good to see you both. Thank you for your time. Just thinking about intergovernmental relations generally, time in office, was it the Scotland office that led on that, or was it the Prime Minister, or was it a combination of both? And do you think that's changed over time?
It was a combination, frankly, because you would have the discussion within government about whatever the issue was, and then you would decide how best to approach it. Would it be something where you would want the initiative to be seen to be coming from the Scotland office, or seen to be coming from the Prime Minister, or from Treasury, or wherever else it was going to be? Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. The Scotland office was quite an important part of that whole matrix there, because there was a very clear determination in government that the No campaign should win the referendum. That was government policy. But sometimes when we talk about these issues, language matters, and sometimes it can jar to a Scottish ear. So, everything had to be sense-checked, and that was a very important part of the work that the Scotland office did. And what I would say is that, within that operation, if David and I had any concerns, then we always expressed them, we took them out, and I would expect more often than not that we would be accommodated in some way.
Yes, I think the other player, Mr. Shanks, is the Cabinet Office, because they saw themselves, perhaps they still do, although Mr. Gove has moved an element of that to his DLUC department. But the Cabinet Office saw themselves as guardians of the overall devolution settlement. That is, the settlements within Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and to an extent within England. And therefore they were also part of the picture. So I certainly saw that there had been some comments, for example, from Professor Kieran Martin, and Kieran Martin was in, he was in the Cabinet Office. I think there is a legitimate discussion going forward as to the respective roles of the Cabinet Office and the individual offices for the Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, because my view, strong view, which I expressed at the time, continues, is that the Scotland office should essentially be the guardian of the devolved settlement in Scotland, in the sense of having the repository of knowledge and expertise on it, rather than a sort of split between the Scotland office and the Cabinet. And the Cabinet Office.
And do you think over time, in our evidence from Alex Salmond, perhaps not surprisingly, he absolutely saw his equal as the Prime Minister, not the Secretary of State for Scotland. Do you think that is just the way we've now got to, that relationship between the Secretary of State for Scotland and the First Minister is maybe less important than with the Prime Minister now? And if that's the case, what does that mean for the mechanics of intergovernmental relations? Does it always have to be at that senior level for things to happen?
Quite a lot to unpick there. This is where we come back to the divergence of personality and policy, isn't it? If I had my federalist ideal, then I think you would have a Department of the Nations and Regions that would be the guardian of all the devolution settlements, because you would have lost that in different speed in different parts of the country, and that asymmetric nature. And indeed in the early days we thought that might be possible, but I think we are now some way away from that, And I think we have the territorial departments for a reason and for a purpose. I think what I would say though, and David's right about the constitutional responsibility within that list of ministerial responsibilities, about the Cabinet Office being the guardian of devolution across the whole of the United Kingdom. That's something that actually should be the concern of every department. And I think that should be the thread that runs through the every aspect of government policy, and it shouldn't just be left to one department to say, oh, but remember that we've got a devolved settlement here. And sometimes that's the case, sometimes not. In the early days, actually, there was a mindset in Whitehall that when you asked something about Scotland, the sort of stock response was, oh no, we don't deal with Scotland anymore, it's devolved. And the quality of drafting of legislation in those early days actually suffered as a consequence. I can remember some really poor examples where, for example, in one of the bills I served on a standing committee for, it said that in Scotland and in England, this will be matters dealt with in the High Court. Now, in England, the High Court is a court of civil jurisdiction, and in Scotland, the High Court of Justiciary is a criminal jurisdiction. And that was just how sloppily things were drafted. I remember the Civil Contingencies Act, as it now is, there was no powers within the bill for Scottish agencies to speak to UK or English agencies. And that was a consequence of the sort of mindset that you found in Whitehall.
I think also you have to accept again that the politics come into play. I think we would all acknowledge both Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon were UK wide known politicians. I recall Mr. Salmond making a great song and dance about the fact that Gordon Brown hadn't spoken to him, and it was there.
Tony Blair could probably have done the same.
It therefore was a thing, and therefore Scotland was being done down because Gordon Brown hadn't spoken to Alex Salmond. So there was always a degree, there was always a degree of politics in it. And my impression was always that the Prime Minister, both Prime Ministers I served under, would always speak to the First Minister if there was a matter of import in relation to Scotland being raised, and there was never any level of access. If it was, as in 2017, Nicola Sturgeon's request for Section 30 powers to have another independence referendum, then that was clearly a political matter and would be dealt with in a slightly different way. But if there was some major event, significant issue in Scotland, then the Prime Minister was always accessible for the First Minister.
Before you, I think, Christy, do you want to comment on this point? It's all right, yeah, okay. Sorry, Michael.
Just on the personality, because whoever we're getting evidence from, it always seems to come back to this. And you said earlier, Mr. Carmichael, that the best structures in the world mean nothing if people aren't willing to make it work. Do you think we have got to a point now where those relationships have broken down, where there just isn't that mutual trust at all anymore? And partly because we've got two governments in Scotland and in the UK that just don't actually seem to want devolution to work. What do you think the route is out of that?
Well, I was, like Mr. Carmichael, I was reflecting over the weekend, and I think, we talked about earlier how perhaps the Scottish devolution settlement hadn't, bedded in as much during the initial periods. But, we've got an example in the United States where they've had a system for over 200 years. And it still if there are significant political differences, it still brings the system to effectively a halt, and they have these shutdowns. So I think ultimately it is hard it's always going to be hard where there are diametrically opposed views. There are political benefits, perceived or otherwise, of creating a dispute. Then it's always going to be difficult to get a way through whatever processes that you have in place. And I hope in those circumstances that it's then incumbent on those involved actually just to take a step beyond the immediate political priority and look for what is actually in everyone's best interests.
Without going into too much detail about who we're talking about and personalities and all the rest of it, I think it is fair to say, and this is certainly true if you look at both the government in Whitehall and the government in Holyrood, that differences often start within governments. And when governments want to manage internal political differences, then quite often the politics takes you to a place where you will manufacture a difference between the governments. And I suspect that historians, when they come to write the story of British politics 2023-24, will identify that as having been a characteristic of how things proceeded at this time.
Christine, did you want to come back in?
Yes, it was just something that occurred to me, which was this period of difficulty between the two governments, the sort of increasing difficulty after 2012. Alistair, you touched on the fact that it's become all about the politics of identity. Mm-hmm. We were very proud in Scotland in the first 10 years of devolution that we moved away from a traditional two-party model, three-party model, and we had this rainbow parliament in 2003 to 2007. And then we went much more back into a structured party dynamic, set along very firm lines, which became even more entrenched with the independence referendum. Since which time it has been really the only issue of debate between the two governments of any note. Everything else has almost seemed to be subsidiary to that. As we near the end of both parliaments, and there is a potential for change, do you think we are about to move into a different age where we will accept that the devolution settlement is the will of the people and start to work more positively again? Are you optimistic about that?
Referring to my earlier comments on the subject of optimism. That will depend on the outcome of the elections across the United Kingdom and in Scotland as a whole. I hope it would, because I don't see devolution as something to be frightened of, and I don't see it as something that is a staging post to something else. If I have any regrets about the campaign I was part of before the Scottish Parliament was set up, it was that we did make it perhaps too much about the distinctiveness of Scotland and less about the fact that this was a better way to govern Scotland. And that, for the same reason I want to see people in other parts of the United Kingdom governed better. So I want to see more power taken away from Whitehall, given to communities in Manchester, Newcastle, Birmingham, wherever else it's going to be. Because if you see it all as something on the basis of your identity, then you don't necessarily get the best political outcome. And you see, I think one of the weaknesses of devolution as it has worked in Scotland is that we now have a system of government in Scotland that is more centralised just on a Scotland-wide basis than it ever was in Whitehall. That process of centralisation has galloped on a pace, I think it produces much worse outcomes. The Scotland that had 7 police forces maybe didn't need 7, but we are not well served just by having 1, or an ambulance and fire service. And you look in terms of the service outcome for the different parts of Scotland, and the truth of the matter is that the further away you get from Edinburgh and Glasgow, the worse the level of service comes. I speak with some passion because I have just spent the weekend visiting my family on Islay, and I look at the absolute shambles that is Caledonian McBrain at the moment. And the fear for me is that the Northern Isles may just be 10 years behind unless we learn from the mistakes of what's happened on the West Coast. You only learn from these mistakes if you engage with the community and you have a government that listens to what the community says they need, rather than giving them what the government themselves think they want.
Do you think Westminster has perhaps become afraid to say what it thinks about Holyrood because of the dynamic in the debate? And perhaps going forward we should be more proactive in not interfering, but proactive in voicing an opinion.
What do we mean by Westminster here?
I mean Scottish politicians who come down to Westminster.
My experience is that Scottish politicians of all parties have been fairly relaxed over the years in opining on matters that are not, strictly speaking, within their constitutional responsibility. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that I've done just exactly that, spurred on by my experience of talking to my family and neighbours from my childhood. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think we can all bring a perspective to it. But if that's all you do, then frankly you are failing your constituents. When I was elected, as you were, Mr. Chairman, in 2001, one of the things I felt was that as the first generation of politicians who were elected to the House of Commons from Scotland, not having previously sat here before devolution, that there was a job of work for us to do in terms of defining the role of the Scottish MP at Westminster. And I like to think that in our own way we have done that. And let's just say, keeping predominantly to dealing with those matters that I am elected constitutionally to deal with, I don't find it difficult to fill my working week.
I think it's, I don't want to take us down a tangent in relation to the performance of the Scottish Parliament over the last 25 years. I am disappointed that the sort of excitement and the positivity, which was genuinely around in 1999, doesn't exist anymore. And I meet few people, who are positive, not about there being a Scottish Parliament, but what they see it delivering on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's very disappointing, given when we were there on the mound in 1999. The expectation was maybe too high, but it wasn't that education would crash, that the health service wouldn't be recognisable, all the other issues that we see. But I do think one issue, again, which I know you, Mr. Chairman, have tried to raise in the past, is I do think there is still a missing piece in relation to the relationship between the two parliaments. Mm-hmm. Joint working has been previously suggested, joint committee inquiries, that we've dabbled in that. I know we've maybe come on to the Sewell Convention. I felt it should be formalised in Westminster procedures. That there is a missing part, actually, even in the intergovernmental side of things, in terms of the working together of MPs, MSPs. I mean, obviously, Mr. Ross is in a unique position at this time to to straddle both parliaments. But I think, I think that even in terms of the even in terms of accountability for intergovernmental relations, that lack of joined-upness by the Parliament isn't quite effective, because, in some of the discussions, I remember particularly discussions which involved Mr. Russell around the European matters. I would report back that we'd had a very positive discussion. Mr. Russell would report back that the end of the world was nigh because of the malfeasance of the UK government. But we weren't both put up together to actually, by respective colleagues, to find out where the position was.
It's not been for the lack of effort from this committee to try and forge those joint working arrangements.
Which I acknowledge. I mean, I acknowledge that you yourself have tried to do a great deal of that.
Grateful for that acknowledgement, but it's also surprising, given that there's now joint responsibilities and a whole range of social security related issues and other matters which are now within joint responsibility, Scottish Government and Westminster. Perhaps that's something for a successor committee to look at in the new session of Parliament, to see if these links could be formalised and perhaps put in place a little bit more vigorously. But I want to come back to the job that both you guys held, and it's surprising that we've received so little attention to the role of the Scotland Office throughout the 25 years. And I think it changed quite dramatically from our early days, 2001, where we were still getting used to the evolution of what the Scotland Office has become. And of course, when this committee looked at constitutional arrangements a few years ago, we suggested that the Scotland Office should perhaps be reviewed, and I think we proposed that a place in the Cabinet that was for all the nations of the UK would probably be a preferable outcome for the management of constitutional affairs. I know that was something that you supported, Mr. Carmichael, before you got your feet under the table in Dover House. But is the Scotland Office imperative, do you think, to the ongoing arrangements of devolution? I mean, would we be able to live without it, as you presumed back in 2007?
I think it would have been an act of recklessness to get rid of it in 2013, when, as you so delicately put it, my feet went under the table in Dover House. In the early days, it struggled. I think all the territorial offices did. Again, over the weekend, I remember some enterprising journalist putting in an FOI request for Helen Liddell's diary when she was Secretary of State for Scotland, and the story of the week was that she had, I think, an hour or two every Wednesday taking French lessons. And we all had good fun with that sort of dock-about sort of thing. The government of the day struggled with it in exactly the same way. The Scotland Office was folded in at different points with Northern Ireland, with transport, I think defence, and that illustrated rather well the way in which it struggled to assert its place in Whitehall. And when you get to that federalist situation, then I think the existence of territorial offices certainly does need to be looked at again. But for as long as the Constitution in Scotland remains a live and dominant issue, it's difficult to see how we get from here to there at the moment.
But it's not just this committee that's suggested that. PACAC, when they looked at 2018, said exactly the same things. And we did have Douglas Alexander and Des Brown at this committee who shared the responsibility as Secretary of State for Scotland with other cabinet responsibilities. And
that's because, you will remember, Mr. Chairman, when we were both elected, people would say, well, do we really need MPs at Westminster anymore? Then, in fact, Tony Blair went off and started a war in Iraq, and people did see that actually there was a useful purpose in sending members of Parliament from Scotland to the House of Commons. and I think that has developed over the years. I think when we do get to that point, though, of having the Office of Nations and Regions, whatever you're going to call it, then at that point it has to be constructed in such a way that if the constitutional issue ever comes to the fore again in the way that it was when we were both there in 2013, 14, 15, that we have a mechanism that is sufficiently plugged in to Scotland's civic life in Scotland, local government, the whole wider range of if I have any criticism of my sort of historic predecessors, is I think they left the stage of public life in Scotland too much. Weeks after I was appointed, I attended the silver medal final at the National Mod. And bear in mind, this was 2013, and devolution had been around since 1999. And Uncommon Gaelach told me that I was the first Westminster UK government minister to attend a session of the Royal National Mod since the advent of devolution.
I agree that it's very important, and as part of the overall settlement that United Kingdom settlement, that Scotland has a voice at the cabinet table. It's very important. Now, as you say, I mean, during the Labour period in office, that was done in combination with other government departments, but of course, in the period in which Alistair and I served, the Scotland Office took forward two major constitutional bills in terms of both the Scotland Acts 2012 and 2016. There was a huge amount of work around Brexit and the subsequent arrangements, all of which I think, in my view, justified the role of the Scotland Office. And as Alistair said, part of the job is actually to be the face of the UK government in Scotland. And I didn't attend the mod, but I did visit and meet with every council leader in Scotland, because again they hadn't met with the UK government in immediately previous years, and whatever you sit on these issues, there are a lot of direct relationships between the UK government and local authorities in Scotland, and establishing those relationships, understanding what was possible, and leading, for example, in your own constituency to a very productive relationship with the council there that's led to the development of the museum and other positive things.
And city deals and island deals and all the rest of it that we've seen in recent years has actually given a much greater force and purpose to the Scotland Office, which just wasn't there in the early days.
Thank you. Sally Hart.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, gentlemen, and thank you for coming to visit us this afternoon. Just putting aside the political differences, I'm going to ask a question to David first about why would the UK's exit from the EU increase the complexity of the devolution settlement, and how did this affect the operation of intergovernmental relations post-2018?
Well, it did so because a number of powers and responsibilities that had been previously exercised through the EU were returning to the United Kingdom, and we had to understand and evolve a basis on which those powers were taken forward either at Westminster or within the Scottish Parliament. And there was a huge list of such powers. I think it was about 155. Others will be able to validate that. But there was a very large number powers, responsibilities, changes to the existing arrangements that had to be negotiated through the system, and also within the context of other parts of the United Kingdom as well, as to how they would be dealt with in Wales, Northern Ireland.
So I remember, when we were having conversations in our select committees and listening to, I suppose it would have been Nicola Sturgeon at the time, the UK government was accused of taking away and grabbing powers back from Scotland, but they were never in Scotland in the first place. It was, there weren't automatically powers that would have been given, and it was a question of how to look at how to govern on a common framework. Is that...
Yes, but I mean, I'm afraid that it goes back to your initial question about setting the politics aside. I'm afraid the politics couldn't be set aside. And I wouldn't wish to accuse the chairman, but I remember one session of Scottish Questions where 8 SNP MPs stood up to demand that the power grab be reversed, and all these powers that were being grabbed. Of course, I mean, subsequent reflection would demonstrate that there were no such powers that were grabbed. But it was the phrase of the moment, the power grab. The UK government is trying to take control of Scottish agriculture. The UK government is trying to take control of Scottish food standards. I'm afraid it's an example of what became an entirely political environment, and it's very difficult in that environment to explain a highly technical issue against just a blanket power grab narrative.
Yeah.
And that was the backdrop, I'm afraid, of that period. But a lot of diligent work, it has to be said, by civil servants in both Edinburgh and in Whitehall, took many of those really complicated issues forward, issues about what chemicals could be in paint, and what food colourings, or a whole range of very technical issues forward, so that actually they could be administered on the basis of a framework. And of course, when push came to shove, there was virtually no difference between the position that the UK government and the Scottish government would have wanted to adopt in relation to that issue anyway. But it was the firestorm, it was the political firestorm of the moment, the power grab.
I think you have to remember also the historical position here. In 1997, when the Scotland Act and the Wales Act were passed and the devolution referendums were held, it was on the universally shared assumption that the United Kingdom would remain part of the European Union. Now you see the difficulties that it has caused in Northern Ireland in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, not to have the United Kingdom as part of the European Union. But also there are difficulties in other parts of the United Kingdom as well. And where you take out some of the processes that you had through the European Union, inevitably you have to find a mechanism for compensating for them. So, the United Kingdom as a single market is a massively important one for Scotland and for Scottish producers of food and drink and all sorts of industry. But if you then think how you administer that single market in the context of a devolution settlement, where the administration of agricultural policy, for example, is devolved, then you do have to find in some way a mechanism for replicating on a UK scale what you had previously in an EU scale, And I don't think we've quite got that right yet. I think there's still work that can be done here.
A problem for Scotland. Scotland doesn't share a border with the EU, so I fail to see how that's a problem for Scotland. Anyway,
no, but it's
on.
A problem for Scotland that you now have things that were decided at an EU level that are being decided as a UK level, where the people making the decision are also part of the competence, if you like. So the DEFRA, to go back to my own example, not only has to be the English government, but the UK government at the same time. And these are not insuperable problems. No. They are all capable of resolution with some care and goodwill, but that was one of the consequences of our decision to leave the European Union.
Thank you. So talking about political differences,
yes.
And there's always a degree in politics, you say, that came in post-2014, really. As the UK government began the legislative process to bring the UK out of the EU, was intergovernmental conflict always inevitable, given the political differences between the two governments over Brexit? Or could conflict have been mitigated through closer intergovernmental working? Would it have helped if the SNP, for example, put Scotland and people first rather than its own political agenda?
Well, I understand the point that you're making, but I think I am very much of the view that it was inevitable. I think you just need to take a step back from the 2019 general election campaign, where the SNP position was stop Brexit. The Conservative position and the government of the subsequent form, let's get Brexit done. So there's quite a difference there in terms of what the approach was, and the Scottish National Party did want to stop Brexit. I don't think that's in dispute. I think it became clear that the process of discussion as to how we left Brexit was seen by some as a way of stopping Brexit by just being as obstructive and as unhelpful as possible. And my own reflection on what changed in the discussions is that Mike Russell in particular, who led many of the discussions, ultimately didn't have the authority in these discussions to actually reach agreements. And we, on a number of occasions, we felt we had reached an agreement. And Mr. Russell returned to Edinburgh, I think, to find that what he thought he might be able to agree couldn't be agreed because that was not politically expedient. And therefore, it was a very political time. And that, that was a huge challenge. And we also, I think, if we're, being frank, as I'm sure you'd want me, Mr. Wishart, if you recall in that Parliament, the government didn't have a majority. And that was quite challenging for any discussion that we had with the devolved administrations, because we could not, the UK government could not necessarily ourselves also deliver what might have been discussed or agreed, because it might not be possible to get it through Parliament. And that is a very challenging environment in which to be working. And if you then throw in a good dose of politics, it makes it even more difficult.
I'll come to you, Alistair, in a minute, but just taking up, following on from that, the Withdrawal Act, or Withdrawal
Yes.
Bill in 2018, which was passed without the Scottish Government's consent. Do you think it should have had their consent? And how did you, as Secretary of State for Scotland, represent Scotland's interests within the UK government during that time?
Well, part of my representing Scotland's interest was I believed that the Scottish Parliament should have the opportunity to debate the issue. because I felt it was important that everybody got their view on the record. But it became clear that for political reasons there was not going to be a legislative consent motion. In my view, and others may disagree, but in my view, that it fell within the not normally process, because this was an extraordinary event, in terms of those events contemplated by the devolution settlement. As Alistair said, in the initial settlement, Britain leaving the EU was not contemplated. So I felt that and believed that there was nothing inconsistent with having the opportunity to debate a sole motion, the motion being debated in the Scottish Parliament but not succeeding, but the government then reflecting on that and deciding that it could proceed anyway. I think one of the things that was more unfortunate, and actually touches into what we were touching on, Mr. Wishart, before, was that there was not actually enough time to debate that issue within this Parliament, and that was, I think, unfortunate. That was unfortunate at that time, that the government's view and why it concluded that it could proceed without the sole motion was not held up to sufficient account and scrutiny at the time. But I think within the spirit and the letter of the Sewell Convention or the legislative consent motion, we were right to take the decision we did.
Thank you. And Alistair, putting aside your own party's position on the EU membership, and in the 2018 debate on the EU withdrawal bill, you said that there'd been a lack of good faith in the negotiations between our two governments, so between the UK and the Scottish Government. How could good faith have been fostered between the governments? Do you think it could have been?
You'll have to remind me the context. I'm sure it was sage words, but you're testing my recollection here.
Let me just go back into my... It was to do with the debates, to do with the... it's going to take me some time to find it.
Well,
so.
Look, let's try and deal with it as well as we can. How does good faith work in politics? It makes all sorts of things possible. Goodwill, good faith allows people who genuinely want to find a solution actually then to go out and find it. And sometimes we manage to do that in politics, and sometimes we struggle to do it. The difficulty, I guess, is that when you have a constitutional issue, whether it's going to be Brexit or Scottish independence, then that becomes the focus of absolutely everything, and the end then starts to justify the means. So, and it is this question about the means that I'm afraid you often see that element of good faith diminishing.
Let me just help the Secretary of State out here, because I've got the quotation.
Sadly, I'm not any longer, but...
It was during the 2018 emergency debate called by the SNP.
Sorry, thank you, Chair.
The EUW bill, and it was in the context of this debate is abject failure of the Scottish Government and United Kingdom to reach an agreement. It's apparent all who took from the outside there is a lack of good faith in negotiations between our two governments. These were the sage words that you...
Sage words, indeed. I'm sure they stand the test of time, and in fact I think probably in that context answered the question. Yeah. It would have been better if governments had been able to take the political heat out of the issue. But for a whole range of reasons, both to do with the support of the government in Westminster, then wanting to get Brexit done, as they said, and also the government in Edinburgh seeing getting Brexit done as being a lever that they could pull to make it easier to achieve Scottish independence. That's where you have that lack of good faith. If you want to look at the various issues, and I've touched on one already, then there are ways around these things. There are mechanisms that can be put in place. But actually, if it's more important for you to achieve your constitutional aim than it is to get a working mechanism that gives security and stability for the future for farmers and crofters, then that's, I'm afraid, where you get taken to.
Or deliver on a decision that the public made, or the majority of the public, not in Scotland, but the UK in general. Thank you. I have one question that's not related to the EU, but to both of you. So, standing back and looking at the sort of devolution, whether it's mayoral or Scottish devolution, it's very easy, let's say, for the Scottish Government never to have to take responsibility or account to Scottish voters for decisions or failures in education or NHS, for example, and they blame the UK Government. How do you think the Scottish Government could be better, could better take responsibility or have to account to Scottish people for the decisions made, and that they're not always let off the hook by blaming the UK Government?
You want to kick off?
Well, I mean, obviously, if Mr Ross was leading the Scottish Government, it would be in a much better position in relation to these
that's guffaws around
these issues.
What's that lump in your cheek there?
I think I don't necessarily, I don't necessarily agree in the sense that the Scottish Government is accountable in elections. In Scotland, I think that the whole West, the whole Scottish Government good, Westminster Government bad, the whole it's all Westminster's, the pothole in my street is Westminster's fault. That has worn thin. And I think the public in Scotland, have seen through that and are demanding, certainly from the people I speak to, to know how the decisions the Scottish Government have taken, why they've taken them, and what their agenda, is compared to what people's real priorities are.
Yeah. I think your question reflects a frustration that we have all felt at times. And it's not unique to the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government. I remember the early days of the Tony Blair Government having exactly the same phenomenon. I would reflect that those in politics who start off as Teflon tend to end up being Velcro, and they pick up absolutely everything. So you go from a state where nobody gets blamed for anything to which they're blamed for everything. But that's true of politics as a whole. I think I would challenge your assertion, though, that the Scottish Government is not accountable. Certainly the conversations I've had with the people I was at school with over the weekend on the subject of ferry services to the West Highlands suggests very much that they are and will be accountable. And indeed, I would just observe in passing that if they weren't, we wouldn't have Mr Shanks sitting in among our numbers today.
Indeed, there is the Scottish Parliament and Scottish democracy.
Thank you, Chair.
Ministers
I hope
are
I didn't offend you.
No, of course, you'd never offend me, Sally Ann. Of course not. Liz Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. I want to pick up on a number of things that have been said so far today, but perhaps, Mr Mundell, if I could begin with you. A lot has been spoken about personalities,
yes.
And this committee was informed just before we moved into the public session that one of those personalities involved, Nicola Sturgeon, contacted the committee late last week to postpone her appearance next Monday. So she is someone we will definitely want to hear from, but due to reasons certainly out with our control, she won't be attending next Monday. However, you served in Parliament with her from 1999. When you were both in opposition, you would have viewed her from Westminster when she entered government as a minister, and she was the first minister during your entire time your initial period as Secretary of State for Scotland. She's the only First Minister you would have dealt with. I think that's correct. So how did you view your relationship with Nicola Sturgeon, and how did things change, if at all, during her time in office and your time in office?
I hope that she will give evidence to the committee, because obviously she's been a very significant part.
Just for clarity, I mean, that was discussed in a private session, and I would have hoped that the confidence of that conversation would have been maintained. But just for the record, that Ms. has agreed that she will come to this committee when she becomes available to this.
In fairness, that wasn't confidential, and I think it certainly would have been public next Monday when there was an empty chair. So I don't think we're breaking any confidences to say that, but perhaps Mr. Mundell could continue.
In any event, I think it's very important that she does attend, because she has a lot to contribute to this discussion and debate, and probably contrary to some of our respective contributions. I found initially that she was a very professional person to deal with, and that we could do business. And I gave the example of the discretionary housing payments, and in relation to the so-called bedroom tax. I had attended I always attend a number of events with her, and in those situations, she was always very professional, and we worked respectfully, I think, together. I think post Brexit, we did see a significant change. I think we saw this period of Scottish exceptionalism develop, so that everything had to be different and dealt with differently in Scotland. We had a period of, I think, obstruction, really, in relation to the Brexit decision and implementing Brexit, and generally an environment of just making things as difficult as possible for the UK government. Now, I don't dispute that as a politician you may wish to do those things, but it became an almost entirely political environment rather than one that was focused on outcomes, and certainly in my view, outcomes that would benefit people in Scotland.
I think for our inquiry, it's just to reiterate, you're saying that there was a change, got progressively worse.
Became progressively more challenging to deal with the First Minister.
And would you say then that the revelation during the COVID inquiry, when it met in Scotland, that there was discussions between Nicola Sturgeon and her chief advisor Liz Lloyd, who suggested that they have a good old-fashioned drammy with the UK government? Is that indicative of what you were seeing after that period?
Well, I was certainly witness on a couple of occasions to rammies that involved the UK government. Without, I think it, as Christine Jardine said, I mean, it was all playing into a sort of, UK government bad, Scottish government good narrative, rather than actually, well, what are we actually trying to do here? What is the outcome we want to achieve? I mean, in relation to Brexit, I held a meeting the day after the referendum with Fiona Hislop, who was then the person, the EU or European spokesman in the Scottish Government, where we had a discussion about whether it would be possible to move forward on a constructive basis. And at that meeting, I was rather hopeful that might, that might be possible. But of course, simultaneously, Nicola Sturgeon was appearing in a press conference to announce that we needed independence to defeat the outcome of the Brexit referendum. So, I mean, almost from that first day, the politics overwhelmed the situation.
And just finally ask about these personalities. You mentioned earlier that you had good relations with John Swinney, but I noted down you said that Mike Russell, during a number of the discussions you had, didn't have the authority. So was this Scottish Government ministers coming in, negotiating with UK Government ministers and potentially agreeing in principle, but then going back to the First Minister and not being able to progress what had been agreed?
That was my impression. because we had previously proceeded where ministers came with a remit and something was agreed. We moved forward those round because there were obviously ministers there from Wales, sometimes ministers, sometimes officials from Northern Ireland. And we did expect these discussions to be a decision-making forum. But it certainly, the impression was given that the decision maker in relation to Scotland was not in the room, but back in Edinburgh.
And you were discussing earlier with Sally Ann Hart about a power grab and the fact that there couldn't be a power grab, obviously, with these legislation and such like authority never lying in Scotland, but in some of the transfer of powers from the UK government and this Parliament to the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament, not all of those powers certainly immediately were taken up. Did you find it strange that in some cases powers asked for, requested and transferred were then not fully utilised? I'm thinking around social security when the Scottish government weren't able to get the procedures in place to deal with these additional powers.
Those powers, of course, came with the Scotland Act 2016 social security powers. By the time that situation unfolded, no, I wasn't surprised, because I had been, for example, in a meeting where there was a RAMI about that the Scottish Government must today be transferred the powers for personal independence payments, and that was in 2017, 2018, and now we're still we're still waiting essentially for that whole system to evolve. So there was very much at that time, because of the politics, a demand: we must have this now, we must do this right now, we're ready to do this. But as events unfolded, it became clear that there wasn't either the capacity, the will, the priority to do those things. So they had really been noise rather than a determination to take it forward.
Before I come to Mr. Carmichael, we've heard throughout this session today and our these kind of three blocks of the last 25 years: Labour in government at UK and a Scottish level, then the independence referendum and a minority then majority SNP, and then Brexit. But there's a small period where you, Mr. Mundell, were the Under Secretary of State for Scotland, and there was still a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition at Holyrood. I think that period 2010 to 2011. No, sorry, that would have been SNP.
No.
There was a period, when you were elected in 2005.
Yes.
When there was a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition in Holyrood. How did you find, as a Conservative MP representing a Scottish constituency, having a Labour UK government and a Labour Liberal Democrat Scottish executive at the time, and how different is it now, still being a Conservative MP but having a different UK government and a different Scottish government?
Well, obviously things are better because we have a Conservative UK government. I think at that time, and I don't, I'm sure there were reasons the settlement was evolving, but it was very clear in that period that Gordon Brown was a very significant player in relation to what happened in the Scottish Parliament and what happened within the Labour Party in Scotland. And I don't think there are many people who would dispute that. So therefore, there weren't, Scottish Labour MPs didn't stand up and say the Scottish Parliament needs to have this happen or that happen. It was dealt within, within those channels. So and I think that may be part of the issue that Alistair touched on when coming in 2001. A lot of these issues weren't as explicit as they are, as they are now. So that the Scottish government makes some pronouncement about unhappiness with the UK government. Mr. Wishart, Mr. Brown, and our colleagues make these points in Parliament. Others have done in the past. Whereas in that period, the things that were causing tension, and there were obviously tension over the free personal care, it wasn't out in the public domain for them to be raised in this Parliament. In fact, the impression conveyed, other than by some of Mr. Carmichael's more independently minded colleagues, was that everything was sweetness and light.
Mr. Carmichael, if I can maybe come to you now.
No idea which Mike Rumbles you're talking about.
Indeed. You mentioned about the mindset in Whitehall that...
In the early days, yeah.
Yes, didn't deal with Scotland anymore. Was it specifically in the early days? Did it continue? Has it got better? Has it been fully resolved, both looking from within government in your time as Secretary of State and also now as an opposition member?
I think we sort of ran the whole gamut from those very early days where the mindset within Whitehall was, why are you asking me this? We've got devolution, and even within the civil service they didn't always understand that they needed to have an understanding of Scottish institutions, law, whatever else. And then you went from that extreme, not to an extreme, but to a position in the time of the Scottish independence referendum where actually, yes, everything did need to be looked at with one eye on Scottish independence, or the possibility as a consequence of the referendum. And everything was seen through the prism of that. And, things that would have been otherwise sensible, fairly routine administrative things. I gave you the example of ROCs closing to be replaced by CFD. Another one would be the management of transitional funding under CAP for Scottish farmers. There was no such thing at that time as an apolitical issue. Everything became political, and it felt as if that it was like, that Radio 4 game show, the Mornington Crescent, where, you always come back to Mornington Crescent. Whatever the question, the answer ultimately was always going to be Scottish independence.
And one of the criticisms now from the Scottish Government is when the UK Government spends money, in their view, in devolved areas. And I'm just thinking of your own constituency, for example, the Fair Isle Ferry, and maybe not so much devolved because there's reserved and devolved competencies, but obviously Saxiford got money in the recent budget. How is that viewed by your constituents in terms of investment? Do they really care who's paying for it? They just want to get that investment. And indeed, is it welcome when it comes to the UK Government because of after years they've not received that funding from the Scottish Government?
I think it's certainly welcome. Who doesn't want investment in their own community?
Well, it sounds like some SNP people.
They can answer for themselves. And you've touched there on two particular projects: the creation of a spaceport in Saxiford, which is enormously important from the UK perspective. This is a strategically important initiative for the whole of the United Kingdom. So, of course, it's entirely appropriate that it should be given funding for from the UK government. And if there's any money to be coming from Edinburgh, we'll take it very cheerfully from them too. I think a canny community can play on the creative tension that there sometimes is between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. Now, you've offered two examples already where I've been part of local initiatives that have brought money. Let me remind you of a third. We had the situation where Shetland had a historic housing debt which was crippling our ability to run our own housing and to provide the housing for our communities that we really needed. We were able to get 10, and there were historic reasons for that, and it was that the money used to go and this is how the Treasury works, you'll know, it went from the Treasury to the Scottish Government, specifically with strings attached, so that it went to councils to pay off their housing debt. These strings were taken off at one point, and the Scottish Government stopped giving us the money to service our housing debt. What happened then was we were able, and any time we raised it, we just got a de plano, no, this is, that was the choice you made not to do the stock transfers that other places did, so get on with it. It was a £40 million debt. We were able to get £10 million from Treasury, and because of the time at which it came, having had this de plano no for years, I think it took about 40 hours to get £10 million out of Holyrood. So, that's sometimes how it works, and if you can get money for your community, then you should. It's part of what we're elected here to do.
I'll only put the Clodagh Bridge in Murray as an example locally for us as well. I want to look at a couple of issues within the Scotland Act and ask you both, but I'll start with you, Mr Carmichael. Obviously, everyone is suddenly an expert in Section 35 of the Scotland Act. During your time, did it ever come across your desk that there may be a need, a requirement, or even a reason to look at invoking Section 35? We know it hadn't been up until the current Secretary of State used it, but was there any time during your period as Secretary of State that you looked at that?
I would hesitate ever to describe myself as an expert, especially in matters of law, since I'm now 23 years away since from any legal practice. But I'm not an expert, but I had read the Scotland Act. I knew it was there. I had always imagined that it would be for something fairly fundamental, like, if, for example, the Scottish Government tried to remove a military base or whatever, something of that sort. So I was aware that it was there. I can say without hesitation that it was never mooted as an option in my time.
Do you agree with the decision taken by the Secretary of State to invoke it on that piece of legislation?
Well, the courts have said that he was right to do it, so who am I to argue with the courts?
It was correct.
Well, I mean, he took a challenge, presumably on advice. I thought it was politically not something I would have rushed to myself. I would have preferred to find an accommodation if it had been possible. As a recovering lawyer, I always know that courts should be taken as the last resort, because apart from anything else, the only people who ever really benefit from it are the lawyers.
Mr Mundell, in your time in office?
I think there was probably more consideration of these provisions, because if you recall, there was a period of discussion as to whether the Scottish Parliament itself could instigate a referendum, which the UK government was clear that it could not. And I think at one stage a bill or a draft bill was actually produced in relation to that referendum. So therefore there was consideration of how the UK government would respond if the Scottish Parliament took forward a bill in relation to holding an independence referendum, which we did not believe was within the power of the Scottish Parliament. So I was familiar with it.
Another area that we've looked at as part of this inquiry is the dual role of the Lord Advocate in Scotland, and I think both of your parties in Holyrood are committed to changing that. There's been consultations, the Scottish Government have been consulting on it for some time. It would take an amendment to the Scotland Act here to do that, despite the historical differences. What is your view now, reflecting back on 25 years of devolution, and at any time while you were Secretaries of State, did you consider looking at separating the role of Lord Advocate, both in the Cabinet of the Scottish Government, head of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland?
Well, we didn't, not least because we weren't asked to. It's always the case in any constitutional set-up that you sometimes come across things that are messy but work. And as long as they're working, people tend not to interfere with them. I think that as the years have gone on, the tension between that dual role as head of the prosecution service and as a government legal advisor has become more acute. I still think it would be something that was best done at the behest of the Scottish Government, whether it were to be done here, which, as you say, it would constitutionally require to be done. But I think it would be... I don't know where the cost... I think the cost-benefit analysis politically of a change like that being initiated from the UK government would come down on the side of the cost rather than the benefit.
And I think the current Secretary of State has said that if there is a request from the Scottish Parliament, he would look at it but wouldn't do it proactively. And just before I come on to Mr Mundell, I mean, part of this conflict has come to the fore again just today, where we hear, I think while we've been sitting, that Northern Ireland will be included in the Post Office exoneration legislation that goes through here. But of course it's a very different legal setup in Scotland, and we have the strange position where the Scottish Government's position is to be part of this bill, but the Lord Advocate's position is very much against mass exoneration. So I don't know how you could square that circle while also wanting to be part of this.
Well, she is bound by collective responsibility. Well, I mean, that's for her to answer, not for me, but like you, I struggle to see what the answer would be to that. It comes back to one of the points that I made right at the very start, and it is about the balance to be struck between process and outcome. And you need to have the process so that if the personalities don't work well, then you've still got a process on which you can rely. The position with post office exonerations, I think, is now quite a sensible one, because the outcome will be the same for people who have been convicted in Northern Ireland as it will be in the rest of the United Kingdom, because there's a particular need in Northern Ireland to have a 12-week consultation for legislation of that sort, quite apart from the fact that they've just got their assembly back up and running and are not short of things that they need to do because they've not been doing them for the last few years now. The Scottish Parliament is not in that position. The Scottish Parliament has overseen a series of prosecutions. Granted, if we were talking about the Horizon scandal as a whole, the blame for that lies fairly and squarely within the UK government for the last 20 plus years. But this is not about the Horizon scandal as a whole, it's about this one element of it. And I feel very strongly that the whole sorry mess of the Post Office Horizon scandal has been allowed to arise because of poor accountability. So actually, the people who need to be accountable for this must be those who took the decision, and they're accountable to the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. They should be getting on and doing the legislation so that the victims are not left in the same position in Scotland as they would have been in Northern Ireland and having convictions quashed later. If there is a conflict between the Lord Advocate and the rest of the Scottish Government, then that is for them to resolve. But it must not allow the victims of these wrongful prosecutions, as I would see them, to be treated worse than victims in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Mr Mundell, your view on the
obviously the changes, any change to the Lord Advocate wasn't part of either the Calman Commission or the Smith Commission, and the Smith Commission was a fairly eclectic bunch of changes that were made. But I think that's because the Lord Advocate wasn't in the same position of political visibility that they are now. When I was in the Scottish Parliament myself, the Lord Advocate rarely appeared in proceedings. So I think it's because there's a perception that it has become more political. And I think, my view is you do need to deal with that perception, but I think it's a decision for the Scottish Parliament to make, and then for the UK Government Parliament to follow through on.
Bear in mind also that there were other changes happening within the way in which the Lord Advocate and the Solicitor General were both appointed the sort of people who could become Lord Advocate and the Solicitor General. So, again, declaring an interest, Eilish Angelini was my first boss when I was a trainee solicitor, and you saw the way that she went through the civil service route, became a Solicitor Advocate, and then was first Solicitor General and Lord Advocate. And, a very strong personality doing, I think, really good, progressive and inclusive things within the legal establishment. And I think that was where the attention lay at that point, rather than the constitutional messy position, which, as I say, for all its difficulties, still worked quite well. Mm-hmm. If it stops working, though, that's when you have to change it.
And just finally from me, Chair, if I can, Ms Mundell, you said earlier you didn't want to be taken on a tangent to discuss the Scottish Parliament, but if I can, because I've asked other witnesses, for you both in your reflections 25 years on from devolution, has the Scottish Parliament, do you think, met the aspirations of not just the people who set it up through the legislation, but the people of Scotland? And I think, Mr Mundell, earlier you said perhaps not the existence of it in itself, but how it has performed. And what could change about the Scottish Parliament? Could they take models here from Westminster or elsewhere from both of your extensive experience in elected office to improve the scrutiny of the government in Scotland, alongside what we do here with the Scotland Office and the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, and improve the workings of the Parliament itself?
Well, in some senses, I don't think it is for us to tell the Scottish Parliament how it should conduct its own internal proceedings. I was very much in support of following some processes here, such as that chairs of committees in the Scottish Parliament should be elected. I think that and be paid, because I think that would be an improvement in the sense that, even when I was in the Scottish Parliament, there's a huge interchangeability between committee chairman and ministerial office. The chairman of this committee has been chairman for a significant period of time, elected by or not even requiring election. Acclaimed. But I actually think that was, and I think one of the previous presiding officers was very keen to take that forward. I think the First Minister, who may subsequently appear in an evidence-giving session, wasn't so keen on that, and perhaps that's something that she might be asked. Because I think that I think there are things that can be learned. I think Alistair alluded to it at the start. At the very start, there was a view that we should do absolutely everything different from Westminster, and for the sake of doing that, so the sake of being different. And one of the first and most early contentious debates in the Scottish Parliament was whether we've had effectively a prayer or time for reflection. And surprisingly to me, Donald Dewar was against that, because he thought that was too Westminster-esque, and that we should not do that. And my late colleague Sir Alex Ferguson pursued that we should, and in fact, but in a different and positive way, so that's time for reflection with different faiths coming in and from different parts of Scotland. So I think the mode of mindset that everything must be different should that needs to be fully repudiated. I think the Scottish Parliament should do should reflect and continue to reflect on how the procedures work. I think it does have to deal with an issue of perception, because we've seen increasing opinion polling about a growing number of people who are unhappy with the Scottish Parliament. I still have a glass half full view, and it's one issue one area in which I might share Mr. Carmichael's optimism. I think the Scottish Parliament can and should be a force for good, but it does have to reflect on people's priorities, and it has to move on from both this constitutional obsession and focusing on niche issues which are those in the minds of a metropolitan elite rather than the people of the whole of Scotland.
Sir Carmichael?
I think it was Enoch Powell who said that all political careers end in failure, and I think the same is probably true to be said about all constitutional innovation. It's never good enough. Whatever we get, it's never going to be good enough because we live in an imperfect world. And the points that David's talking about there, I think it is curious that people in Scotland, if there's any sort of data to support this, would somehow or another criticise the Scottish Parliament when they have a dislike of things that are being done by the Scottish Government. But I suppose that, in fairness, happens here from time to time. This whole question about, well, we can't do anything that's done at Westminster, I think is dangerous. You risk being defined by someone else if you say, I will do nothing that they do, as you would be if you said that I will do everything that they do. There are this place needs massive reform, well, no doubt about that, but there are some things that work well. I think one of the things, that works quite well is the select committee system. I think one of the things that worked quite well in the early days of the Scottish Parliament was the committee system, but I do see it as something which is now creaking, and again, it comes down to personality. A lot of it seems to depend on who is in the chair. And I think one of the changes that we've brought into our procedures here was significant was to hand the election of select committee chairs over to members as a whole. I think that's been a good thing. And if our colleagues in Holyrood were to look at it, they might find that there was quite a lot to recommend it for them too. But that's their decision.
Thank you both very much.
On a very positive note, I think we'll have to bring these proceedings to a close. But could I thank... Oh, sorry, Alan.
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yes, of course, yes, please.
Thanks, Douglas. Apologies, I was late. I was actually getting tooth roots extracted, so I'm in much more pain than anything I can inflict on you guys. You'll be pleased to know. Can I just start with yourself, Mr. Mundell? So
Yes.
You're Under Secretary of the Scottish Office 2010, 2015, I believe.
That's correct.
So when you started there, was there any feeling that it was chronically understaffed at all?
I think it was staffed to the responsibilities that it carried out. In the earlier part of the discussion, we've touched on the changing nature of the Scotland Office and the activities of the Secretary of State for Scotland. So it was staffed for the responsibilities that were then and the way of operating that was then in place.
Can I put the same to yourself, Mr. Carmichael, but also just to point out, so 2010, the number of staff at the Scotland Office was 92. That increased to 111 by 2015, which increased to 21%. And this Parliament went up again, so it's now over 130 on average. So that's a 40% increase since 2010, but yet clearly we've had 2 further rounds of devolution since then. So that surprised you there's now so many staff there, even compared to your time?
I mean, for my time, we absolutely needed all the extra staff that we had. We brought them in from across Whitehall. They performed a very important function. And, that's a consequence of the fact that you have a changed political landscape at that point. What I don't know if you were in the room for to hear Mr. Mundell talking, but subsequently the nature of that relationship has changed, and I don't want to put words in David's mouth, but essentially he's said that there was an element of disagreement for the sake of disagreement, and if you're telling me that the consequence of that is more expenditure for the taxpayer on civil service, then I'm not massively surprised.
Okay, but when you left office, you didn't think we were short of maybe another 20 staff here, another 20% increase would be needed to make...
There's a lot happened since I left in 2015, and quite apart from anything else, we have exited the European Union. We've had all the challenges of dealing with a pandemic. Again, I think before you arrived, there was some reference to by Mr. Ross to an exchange between Nicola Sturgeon and Liz Lloyd, which characterised an approach to intergovernmental relations involving a good old-fashioned rammy. If that's how you do your politics, then inevitably it affects how government operates and how government has to operate. I don't know why these extra staff are there. This is not something, if Mr. Jack comes to your committee, you can doubtless ask him, and he will justify it.
My question was, did you think there was a need for 20 extra staff when you left office?
No, I only knew the need that there was when I was there, and I was certainly satisfied that the staff that we had was sufficient, and they were very good, effective staff. A lot of things happened after that, and other people have to decide what is appropriate to meet these needs. The needs change, your staff will change.
Well, I argued, we didn't get it in my question, but I argued for additional staff, and therefore I'm pleased that additional staff were delivered, because I felt that the Scotland Office, for some of the reasons that we've talked to in terms of ensuring that people there had the expertise that was required, for example, in relation to the devolved settlement, in order to support what were then the city and growth deals, now are more under the also under the heading of levelling up. I felt that as the Scotland Office's role evolved, more staff were required to take that forward.
Move on. Listen, your Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr. Mundell, changing tax slightly. So now Lord Cameron cut onshore wind farms from the CFD process as part of his cut the green crap agenda. But obviously Scotland had massively developed an onshore wind regime and had embraced renewable energy. Now, energy ministers at that time were looking at finding ways to see if sites based in Scotland still could access subsidies, even though clearly the UK government policy was no onshore wind farms in England.
Yes.
But it was suggested that you opposed that and you refused to release any memos or internal documentation, even under FOI, because I was involved in trying to find out answers to that. Was that an appropriate use of your position when you effectively blocked the UK government and the Scottish government trying to work together to allow that renewable energy development in Scotland?
Well, I think the difference between the position in England and in Scotland is that in England communities have a key role in determining whether onshore wind takes place. That is not the case in Scotland. The vast majority of these decisions are made by the Scottish Government. A large proportion of those are overruling the views of local authorities and local people. So we did not have. That's
your opinion.
Well, you've asked me for my. That's why I'm here to give my opinion. You may or may not agree with it. That is the context. That is the context of decision making.
On your opinion, then you thought it was valid to block onshore wind farms in entirety in Scotland during that period?
I think if you look back, you will see that onshore wind farms in their entirety are not blocked in Scotland, and a very significant amount of onshore wind in Scotland went ahead without taxpayer subsidy.
So you don't regret that? You don't think that was an abuse of your position? Blocking fellow UK government ministers?
I regret that people in Scotland don't have the same influence in their community as to whether there is a large-scale wind farm development in their community as people do in other parts of the United Kingdom. And I think that there should be a consistent approach across the United Kingdom on that issue.
Right, so you think Westminster should make further laws to govern?
Well, I think, Mr. Brown, you are going down exactly the route of the conversation that we've had for the last 2.5 hours, where we are identifying Scotland good, Westminster bad. And I think, hopefully, the conclusion that the committee has drawn from Mr. Carmichael and I's evidence is that that's not a very productive way to take matters forward for Scotland.
If I jump tack again, so Mr. Carmichael, obviously, when you were in part of the coalition with the Conservatives, the big controversial moment for the Lib Dems was clear the tuition fees, increasing tuition fees from £3,000 to £9,000 per annum, which obviously went against the Lib Dem pledge. Was there any internal discussions about the pressure that would put in Scottish universities in terms of the different funding models and what that £9,000 meant, or was there even any intergovernment discussions?
Well, it's interesting you talk about internal discussions, because I did actually discuss this recently with Lord Wallace of Tankerness, and he said that the point at which they made the decision that the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Scottish Executive then was had when they made the decision to abolish tuition fees in Scotland was that it was on a very clear understanding that the funding for higher education in Scotland would be maintained, and that the consequence that so many young people in Scotland have now is that they can't get access to the high tariff, highly subscribed courses. I'll speak with some passion again here. My own son is just finishing a degree in veterinary medicine at Bristol University because of subject choices he made where he wasn't eligible even to be considered in Scotland. So, the fact that the funding levels that were given to Scottish higher and further education by that executive have not been maintained by subsequent Scottish governments has created problems. But, if you create a problem for yourself, Mr. Brown, then you have to solve it for yourself. You can't just look around for somebody else south of the border to blame.
So you don't think, you never thought any of these pressures come from
Of course we knew, decision? But listen, there are priorities to be made and decisions to be made, and the decisions that your colleagues in Edinburgh have made have been to salami slice the funding, especially of colleges, but of higher education as well. And I think if that's the decision that you and your colleagues make, then it is one for which you have to be accountable, and you can't just turn around and blame Westminster all the time. If there is a problem with Scottish politics and the standing of Scottish politics, then I'm afraid that may well be at the heart of it.
Right, so it's the Scottish Government's fault about the implications.
It's the Scottish Government's decision to prioritise the spending of money that they have, and they have chosen other priorities.
Just ask, in terms of intergovernmental relations, when you were involved in leaking the memo that was supposed to have been, French ambassador said that the SNP or Nicola Sturgeon would prefer a Conservative government coming into power in 2015. Did you have any thoughts about what that would mean for intergovernmental relations, or was it just a political tool and take it from there?
I think that's all fairly well debated. It was the subject of 2 days in the election court. I don't think there's a great deal I could really add to that, and others would speak to whether or not it did actually have any impact on intergovernment relations. I've certainly never heard it suggested that it did.
That didn't factor in the thought process.
No, I don't really think there's an awful lot more I can say to help you with there, Mr. Brown.
We can just state what we're trying to discuss here.
I think
it was intergovernmental relations.
That would be helpful.
Very significant potential impact.
Is that you got any further questions, Alan? Yeah.
I'm tempted for more, but yeah, I can draw it to.
Okay, well, maybe, Christine, would you... I'm just keen to let you gentlemen away by 5 o'clock. But could I just thank you both for your time and attendance this afternoon? I think there's a couple of things you said you might get back to us. I can't really remember or recall. But for today, thanks very much for your attendance and participation in this. And I hope you enjoy the report once it is produced and take
we shall read it with
interest in it. But for this afternoon, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.